The Catholic Church has in many ways defined modern Irish history. For many people, being Irish and being Catholic are almost the same thing. Yet its rise to the incredible power it enjoyed in the 20th century is far from straightforward. It had to endure the penal laws of the 18th century, rebuild itself in the aftermath of the Great Hunger, yet it would go on to survive revolutions, the change in government, the establishment of the Irish Republic, to enjoy incredible power in the mid-20th century. But its downfall has been equally spectacular. In this video, we're going to explore how did the Catholic Church become so influential in modern Ireland and what ultimately led to its demise. Because today, mass attendance is at one of its lowest levels in Irish history. This is going to be a journey that will take us through the 18th and 19th centuries, explore how the Catholic Church got control of education, and also I'll give you my theory on why I think Irish independence, contrary to what a lot of people say, actually sowed the seeds for the downfall of the Catholic Church. It's a really interesting topic and we've got a lot ahead of us. Before we begin, I'll introduce myself. My name is Finn Dwyer. I'm an Irish historian and I'm also the creator of the Irish History podcast. I've also made a few videos here on YouTube around this topic and I'll link them beneath this video. I'll put a playlist at the end of the video as well. But if you want to find out more about the Catholic Church and Irish history, check those out. Finally, I will say thanks for all the feedback on the backdrop to the videos. I've rearranged this with Kate's help, so hopefully you enjoyed it. If you've got any other tips, leave a comment below and I'll try and incorporate them. But now let's look at the rise of the Catholic Church in Irish history. How did it become so powerful? Because if you lived in Ireland in 1750, you would not be backing the Catholic Church to become one of the major power brokers in Irish history in the following centuries. Key to understanding the story of the Catholic Church and its rise to power in Ireland is something called the Penal Laws. Now, I've covered them in previous videos, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. But from about 1700 onwards, Ireland was under the control of a Protestant government, and with support from their British allies, they instituted something called the Penal Laws, which basically viewed all Catholics with suspicion and punished them on the basis of their religion. Now, the Catholic Church itself was singled out under these laws. It was very difficult to become an educated Catholic priest. The Church at times faced very severe repression in the 18th century. Now, these would start to come to an end in the 1770s and 1780s, but overall, the Catholic Church in Ireland at this point, even though 80% of the population were Catholic, the church itself was incredibly weak. It did start to rebuild itself, but even as the penal laws were relaxed in the 1770s and 1780s, the church itself was still living almost in the shadows, and it would only be after Catholic emancipation in 1829 when it started to truly rebuild its power. So let's look at that now. In 1829, after years of campaigning, the British government finally passed something called Catholic emancipation, and this abolished the final vestiges of the penal laws. Now, while the Irish Catholic population more generally benefited from this, the Catholic Church itself was finally able to emerge from what had been the margins of Irish life and reassert its power. In the years after Catholic emancipation, they started to build churches across the island. Indeed, if you travel around Ireland today, in rural Ireland in particular, some of the biggest buildings you'll see are Catholic churches built in the immediate aftermath of emancipation. However, even though emancipation was passed in 1829, the Catholic Church in the lead up to the Great Hunger of the 1840s was in a very weak position. The church itself wasn't very centralised. The authorities in Dublin and even bishops had limited control over priests in rural Ireland. Indeed, in some cases, priests were married, which was obviously against Catholic Church teaching, and the population themselves had what you might describe as an almost laissez-faire attitude to their religion. A lot of church services would actually take place in the home of parishioners. So, for example, baptisms would take place in the home. So the church itself is not as influential as it would become. On top of this, there's actually a lack of priests and nuns on the island. Don't forget, this is a time when the Irish population is growing extremely rapidly. So it's about 5 million people in 1800, but by 1845 it's grown to 8.5 million, but there's not enough people becoming priests. So you've got a shortage of priests to spread the church message. Now, the Great Hunger of the 1840s, something I've covered extensively on this channel, will become a defining moment for the Catholic Church, but not for the reasons you might imagine. So let's turn to that now. Now, the Great Hunger of the 1840s transformed every aspect of Irish society, and the Catholic Church was massively impacted, but not in the ways you might expect. So there's a couple of things that happened during the Great Hunger that will have a huge impact on the Catholic Church. So first and foremost, there's obviously a dramatic drop in the Irish population from death and then emigration, which will continue right through the 19th century. This will benefit the Catholic Church, as I'll explain in a minute. Secondly, and independently of the Great Hunger, but something that's very important, is that there's a major reorganisation of the Catholic Church underway in Ireland in the late 1840s. Cardinal Paul Cullen comes back from Rome and he starts to reorganise the Catholic Church. He will basically enforce a new structure on the Catholic Church. A lot of those priests I mentioned earlier who were somewhat wayward and not following church teaching were defrocked. So there's hundreds and hundreds of priests who were defrocked around this period as well. On top of that, Cardinal Cullen drives a process where he moves all church practices like baptisms, marriages, funerals, everything are to take place inside the Catholic Church. And this will help strengthen the influence of the Catholic Church in Ireland. But let's move the story into the 1850s and 1860s in the aftermath of the Great Hunger, because we see major shifts underway during these decades. So as the Irish population continues to dramatically fall due to emigration in the 1850s and 1860s, the Catholic Church is enjoying a very different experience in these decades. They have growing numbers of people joining the priesthood and joining religious orders and becoming nuns and brothers. So this means that while the general Catholic population of Ireland is falling, the number of priests to service the existing population is rising. So therefore, basically, you've got more priests for the population, and this also helps to extend church influence over wider Irish society. Now, this takes two key forms though. Obviously people are going to mass, but on top of that, the church extends its influence into two key areas of Irish life that will become essential to making it the most powerful institution on the island in the 20th century. And this is their control over education and healthcare. So let's look at them now. Now, to understand the Catholic Church's control over education in Ireland and also healthcare to a certain extent, we need to first look at their relationship to the British government who ruled Ireland in the 19th century, because it's very different than you might expect. So the Catholic Church had consistently, since the 1790s, opposed any revolution or rebellion in Ireland. Indeed, generally speaking, they were very uncritical when it came to British rule on the island. They did this because they were very much focused on rebuilding the church itself, but they also feared if they criticised the British government too much, this could lead to a reintroduction of the Penal Laws. On top of this, the British government also gave the Catholic Church in Ireland grants, so they had a relatively cosy relationship, contrary to what you might think. However, the Catholic Church did make one major stand in the 1830s. And it was very clear to the British government that they would have to give in on one issue, and this was education. So in the 1830s, the British government establishes kind of primary schools all across Ireland, but the Catholic Church make it very clear that if they don't have control over the education of Catholic children, they'll oppose this bill and try and stop it going through. So this leads to a situation where the British government are actually quite happy to do this. They allow the Catholic Church to take control over the education of primary school children in Ireland. But this is a key building block for the Catholic Church, something that will become really important later on in this video, because the Catholic Church recognise if they can educate children, inculcate them with Catholic values and Catholic ideas, they will go on to essentially build a Catholic society. Then in the aftermath of the Great Famine, the Catholic Church also started to move into healthcare and providing healthcare for their Catholic parishioners. Again, the British government at the time, who's governing Ireland, are quite happy for the Catholic Church to do this. It means they don't have to do it. So through the 19th century, you see the Catholic Church not only build up its own power, but it's also extending its own power into education and healthcare. Lots of Catholic priests, Catholic nuns and brothers become teachers or work in hospitals. So let's take the story into the early 20th century and the Irish Revolution, because the role of the Catholic Church in the Irish Revolution is very different from what you might imagine. Now, the early 20th century in Irish history is defined by Ireland's struggle for independence, which sees a war of independence end in a treaty in 1921 with Britain, and then the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922. However, contrary to what you might think, the Catholic Church in Ireland is pretty wary of any revolutionary movement. So over the course of the 19th century, they'd already become extremely powerful under British rule. They'd made a series of agreements with the British government. They'd received funding from the British government under a series of different acts. On top of this, they'd gotten a lot of control over the healthcare system. The church itself had massively reorganised and built this network of churches all across the island. So they had a lot to lose if a revolution went against their interests. Indeed, the Catholic Church all across the world was generally opposed to revolutionary movements, and this was the consistent position that dated back to the 1780s when the French Revolution had stripped the church of its power in France. So as Ireland heads into a revolution after the outbreak of the First World War, the Catholic Church is stridently opposed to this revolutionary movement. Indeed, during the War of Independence, they'll condemn the IRA time and again, and even the Bishop of Cork, Daniel Colohan, will actually excommunicate the Cork IRA from the Catholic Church. So you might think then that this has left the Catholic Church in an uneasy position when these same revolutionaries essentially win the War of Independence and establish a new Irish state in the 26 southern counties, the Irish Free State. These people are now the masters of this jurisdiction, but the Catholic Church has been incredibly hostile to them. However, within a matter of weeks or even months, the Catholic Church has very quickly emerged as a major force in this new Irish Free State. So let's look at what happens after Irish independence in 1922. Even though the Catholic Church had been quite hostile to the Irish revolutionary movement, they had one major benefit. The Catholic Church, as we've already seen, had basically controlled the education of Catholic children since the 1830s, and they had inculcated most of this revolutionary generation, who were by and large Catholic, with Catholic values. They all had a high regard for the Catholic Church. So even when they had been excommunicated in some cases during the War of Independence and later the Civil War, most of these people were very distressed by this, and they wanted a good relationship with the Catholic Church. They highly respected church leaders, they valued church teaching, they held Catholic ideas. So after independence, the Catholic Church has actually more influence, not less. Basically, they're pushing an open door when they want to influence politicians in Ireland after independence. Before independence, they had to influence politicians in London. However, now they're actually influencing politicians that Catholic priests had taught and inculcated with these Catholic values. And this will see the influence of the Catholic Church go to unparalleled heights in the following decades. A lot of the revolutionary generation, the leaders who take control of Ireland after independence, are very happy to pass increasing influence to the Catholic Church over a lot of social teaching. So for example, while they obviously influenced the education system like they had prior to independence, the Catholic Church is also able to have other measures enacted. So for example, in another video I covered how Ireland actually had a ban on contraception from the 1930s on, and that's a direct result of Catholic teaching. And their values spread right through society because of this dynamic where they had educated and influenced Irish society right through the 19th century, including that generation who found the Irish Free State. So next, let's look at the 1950s when the Catholic Church is at its height, and then we'll track its downfall. The 1950s in Ireland is generally considered to be the time when the Catholic Church was at its height. There's a famous picture of the Archbishop of Dublin, the highly influential John Charles McQuaid, with Eamon de Valera, and it kind of embodies this mid-20th century Ireland where the church influences a huge amount of aspects of Irish life. I've talked a lot about these, how they influence everything from education to healthcare. But it's at this moment of their greatest power where you can start to see the seeds of what will become their downfall. Firstly, from the 1960s onwards, you can see the start of social change that will sweep all across the world, influencing Irish society in small ways. Now, this will gain pace in the 1970s and 1980s. You get the rise of a feminist movement who is very critical of the way the church influences Irish society. On top of this, you also see the emergence of a small but very vocal LGBTQ movement, which organises the first gay rights parades in Ireland in the late 1970s and early 80s. So you can see the origins of what's called later on actually in Ireland the liberal agenda, but basically there's pressure in Ireland to change and move in a more liberal direction, and this directly contradicts the way the Catholic Church want Irish society to be run. However, it's in the late 1980s and early 1990s when this starts to crystallise. There's a series of different things that start to happen at the same time. Firstly, there's the beginning of major church scandals. We'll look at them, but also at the same time, Irish society is continuing to liberalise, and these two forces will combine in the early 21st century to contribute into what is a dramatic fall in the power of the Catholic Church. So to finish the video, let's look at those. Even as late as the 1990s, Ireland seemed to be a remarkably devout Catholic country, to outsiders at least. However, beneath the surface there was changes underway. I've already mentioned there was a growing liberalisation of Irish society, but there was still a 90% mass attendance rate. That meant that 90% of all Catholics were going to mass every Sunday. However, the 1990s would become one of the key decades in the downfall of the Catholic Church. The growing liberalisation of Irish society would find expression in things like the legalisation of divorce and also the decriminalisation of homosexuality. Believe it or not, homosexuality was actually a crime in Ireland. On top of that, however, faith in the Catholic Church is absolutely shattered by a series of scandals. Some of the earliest scandals were actually around the issue of hypocrisy. So for example, this priest, Father Michael Cleary, and this priest, Bishop Eamon Casey, would be revealed as complete hypocrites. These two men had been very prominent Catholic clerics in Ireland. They had preached Catholic values, they had preached against sex before marriage, and then it emerged that both men had actually had their own families. Now obviously Catholic priests are not supposed to have partners, but on top of that they were telling people they couldn't have sex outside of marriage when they, as I say, had had two families. Alongside this, Irish society began to learn of the appalling abuse scandals that seemed to be endemic in the church. It began to emerge that in church-run institutions, essay of young people in these institutions have been protected and shielded by the church. So basically when priests or brothers were accused of SA, they'd generally be moved to a different diocese. The church wouldn't report them to the authorities. And as this started to emerge, people learned about how the church had not only protected these criminals, but also moved them to new dioceses where they'd continued on with these crimes. And this would repeatedly emerge time after time through the late 90s into the early 2000s, and even up to the present day. We're learning more and more about the abuse that the Catholic Church protected. It should be said that there probably wasn't more abuse going on in the church than in wider society, but what did make it different is the Catholic Church was willing to protect these abusers and not report them to the authorities. Now this would have the effect of absolutely shattering the faith of many devout Catholics. We can see this in the decline in mass attendance that continues from its height, say, like at 90% down to 60% in the 2000s, and it's continuing to decline today. On top of that, there are other factors that have contributed to the decline. So we've already seen that Irish society is liberalising. On top of that, the internet obviously has had a huge impact on wider society, and that has affected the influence of the Catholic Church. Now, overall, the story of the Catholic Church in Ireland is a really dramatic one. It's a story of a remarkable rise and then a dramatic fall. I've created a playlist of different videos that look at various aspects of the Catholic Church, from the Penal Laws through how they reacted during the Great Hunger, and you can find out more then. Finally, if you've got this far in the video, I would really appreciate if you haven't subscribed, please do so now. It really helps build the channel, help these videos in the algorithm. And also, if you have any other suggestions for videos you'd like me to make, please do drop a comment below. I generally try and make my content based around your recommendations. Okay, I'll be talking to you soon. Until then, slán.